The Business of AI podcast, exploring how businesses are using AI to build services and tools, transforming organisations and delighting consumers. Produced by UKAI and hosted by Tim Flagg. AI is our business.
Welcome to another episode of the Business of AI podcast, and I'm delighted to welcome Rachael Mole from Moleworks today. Rachael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. So let's start off by finding out a little bit about you. Could you tell us about your background and how you ended up doing what you're doing today?
So I'm Rachael Mole. I describe myself now as an independent AI ethicist, mainly because I focus on the user experience of AI and how it's interacting with disabled people's lives, fundamentally how access matters when it comes to accessing society as a whole. And as we know, AI is now in pretty much every single facet of society. So I run Moleworks Solutions, which is an operations management consultancy based in Yorkshire, but I also sit on several government advisory panels, including DIPTAC, the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee, and the Automated Vehicle Expert Advisory Panel and Access Advisory Panel. So though my independent work mainly focuses on what ethical AI looks like in practice for disabled people, I also have a personal passion for employment as a particular area of interest. I'm a Churchill Fellow, so my research with that focused on how building work cultures for disabled people drives wider innovation in organisations. And I also published a white paper late last year, which was the largest collection of research, legislation and policy on reasonable adjustments, of which AI and the future of adjustments was a hugely core theme. And with that, a question I keep coming back to is, as AI completely reshapes how we work, who gets left behind? And are we building systems that create new barriers while also claiming to remove old ones?
Yeah, well, fascinating work. I'm looking forward to finding out a little bit more about all of those areas. You mentioned that it kind of comes from sort of the user and thinking about the user's experience. I wonder whether we could start there. And it sounds like that's an area that many people will be familiar with, that concept of user design, user experience. How does that then evolve into both thinking about people with disabilities and what their needs are specifically, and how are those two things related? Is that a relatively new field within UX?
New field, certainly not. I think probably a field that has been taken seriously in just digital UX for many years, but I think one that, unless you know about it, it's not really something that people consider. And I think especially as digital skills have become like that, you no longer need an IT degree or to be involved in the tech industry to now kind of own, whether it's like through product management or project management, part of the process of delivering a piece of technology. That's where we're seeing people really having no idea that even access should be something that they consider. And usually it comes in too late. So it's tacked on at the end as, oh no, we've got legislation and legal requirements we have to meet. And it's then a very expensive retrofit at the end. So I have lived experience of disability. I'm disabled myself, and 1/4 of the UK population is disabled. So when we're talking about user experience of disabled people, I think what we have to reframe it as is the user experience of tech users. This isn't a small niche group of people. And as we expand the disability kind of label into something called the social model, which describes disability rather than it being the person who's disabled, it's society that disables people. We can also start describing people as disabled or them describing themselves as disabled people who are elderly, who are temporarily disabled with an injury, or even people who, if you're pushing a pram down a street, or you have children screaming in the background of Zoom calls, that is still how people can be disabled by the technology and the infrastructure that surrounds them. So yeah, I'm really keen to kind of move it out of a niche topic and into just user experience in general.
Yeah, and thank you, because I think that was a really good place to start, because I admit I came in with a little bit of a sort of conception there that it was this sort of new thing, but I think frankly that shows my ignorance in terms of understanding where that fits in. And so thank you for explaining that. I think what was really interesting there was that you referred to that as being something that is in society more broadly. And I think that's probably true, that there is a lack of awareness, there is a lack of understanding of this. But then from a commercial perspective, you also link that to the fact that if companies aren't thinking about this at the beginning, then it actually has a bigger impact, and they need to fix things at the end, which has a bigger commercial impact than had they actually thought about it at the beginning, not to mention the impact it has on their brand. But one of the things I wanted to ask you on that, though, was around how these different disabilities vary, because you mentioned 1 in 4 people have some form of disability. Now, I'd love to sort of understand the variety, because I'd imagine some are less and some are more, on whatever dimension. And so when you're thinking about how to accommodate those different disabilities, there's not really one size fits all. So how should companies be thinking about that?
I think the concept of designing something that is universally accessible is a bit of a fallacy. No one tool or product that is set will ever be able to achieve universal design, purely because even for different disabilities, the requirements and the needs overlap and will change based on what that individual needs. So when we're talking about disabilities, it's everything from mobility, and bringing this back to tech. So this could be, for example, mobility. Somebody might be unable to use their hands or their fingers in a dexterous way. So typing on a keyboard or swiping on a touch screen might be really difficult. Or then we have cognitive, so that might be everything from dementia to something like autism or ADHD or dyslexia, dyspraxia. So when we're thinking about tech, it's is the design intuitive? Is it very obvious of which buttons to press in which order to get the outcome that's desired? Then we have energy disabilities. So for that's things like chronic fatigue, and where for me, one of my conditions is an energy disability, and my biggest bugbear when doing something digital that requires me to sit down for half an hour in like a form and it doesn't save the progress, and I can't always guarantee that I'm going to be able to get to the end of that form if it's taking a lot like cognitively out of me, and to then finish it to the best of my ability. And then we have visual disabilities, hearing disabilities. Both of those I think I'd hope would be pretty self-evident of some of the barriers that people could face when using technology. But visual isn't just being blind, visually impaired. It's also color and color contrast, which I'm glad to say it appears to be getting a bit more attention. But you'd be really surprised as to how many websites have terrible color contrast, and you just immediately something that is a very easy fix becomes impossible for somebody to navigate. So it also varies. I present my disability. Some days I'm very slow cognitively. My energy is really poor. I'm in a lot of pain physically. So technology is often a lifeline on those days as well. But if I'm facing off against some software or an app, or even my inbox, sometimes it's not an intuitive system, and it just adds barriers to me being able to get work done. So it's important to recognize that it's not fixed, that disability can fluctuate. No one condition presents in the same way in different people. So my condition affects me how it affects me, and somebody else could have exactly the same diagnosis and they could have a very different experience themselves. So it's a really kind of big conversation, yes, but I think there's tools that are there to help us. So legislation like WCAG, that kind of is a really great starting block that not many people follow.
Sorry, what was it called?
WCAG, so WAG. And then there's been a recent one, so in the EU Accessibility Act as well. I can send over links to share along with the notes of this for people to read up on that. And it's so there are tools and parameters set out that kind of show a level of best practice. And it's always helpful for people to follow that, but then also an understanding of that's the baseline, like that's what we have to get right. But there's so much we can do on top of that by listening to disabled people and considering us and our experiences in the development process.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you mentioned some of the legislation and some of the sort of codes of conduct which are out there. I know you were sort of saying that's just the baseline, but could you help us understand what currently exists? So if someone was creating a website, or we'll come on to AI tools in a minute, but what currently exists in terms of that legislation? Is it EU-wide legislation? Is it UK legislation?
Yes, so it is. It's interesting. So there is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So that's WCAG. They are internationally recognized standards, but they're not laws themselves. They serve as essentially a compliance benchmark for global accessibility laws. So like the UK Equality Act and public sector body regulations. So generally they are updated, and we recently had one had it updated. So companies now are expected to meet WCAG 2.2. And then there's different levels within that. So the highest level to achieve is now testing my memory here off the cuff. I think companies are expected to meet level AA to avoid essentially like legal penalties. So a disabled person can reasonably expect a government website, for example, to have that level, because it's an indication of being able to access necessary needed information, and that if they did not have access to that, that is then they're being discriminated against. So it essentially ensures that websites, are perceivable, they can be operated and they can be understood, and they're robust. They are robust enough to for any user to be able to access the content. So it's helpful to have that as a benchmark. And so the levels are A, AA, and AAA. So there is a gold standard, but that's really like rarely mandated as needing to be met.
Yeah. No, I've come across AAA before. Had a great designer who, whenever we were building websites and apps, would always insist almost, well, literally by design from the beginning on ensuring everything was AAA in
Yeah.
terms of how it was designed, which was great. So I want to come on to AI a little bit now as well,
Yeah.
because the AI world, there are many different areas of it, from the foundation models to the apps, to the platforms, to companies who are just using it to transform their internal processes. But I imagine there are particular areas here which you're working on with some of your clients. Could you talk us through how AI is making the situation better, or maybe making the situation worse, or maybe both?
So most of my work at the moment is on in that employment sector for AI rollouts. So thinking about we've given all of our team or across our company licenses to something like Copilot, or um, we've written policies that have it all. We're ready to go, but nobody's using it, or not enough people are using it, or we're getting requests through for people to use it as a reasonable adjustment, or even the other side of that is we would like people to be able to use it as a reasonable adjustment because we see the potential of that, but we don't know where to start. So again, like this is the user experience of this technology. Is I'm a really big believer that as a reasonable adjustment, so in the UK, that's a legal requirement under the Equality Act, for people who require an adjustment to do their work to the best of their ability, but are hindered to do so because of a barrier in the workplace that is that their disability compounds. So it could be anything from something physical like an ergonomic chair to a piece of technology that you dictate to and it types up notes for you, or it's a particular project program that you put in information and it finds what takes a big chunk of text and it turns it into bullet points, so it's easier to comprehend information. And where AI is really coming into its own, I feel, in this particular area, is that it has the ability to potentially open the door to that universal design piece, because it's not a static piece of technology in that it can learn from an individual, and it can develop and train itself on the prompts and so in this respect we're talking about generative AIs and LLMs. It can learn from an individual what their need is. So it then becomes a very hyper personalized tool for somebody to use. We are opportunity wise, it takes a lot right now. So reasonable adjustments, the process for that involves a lot of like repetitive asks, documentation heavy work. Even the simple act of like requesting a reasonable adjustment can be really tricky. It also requires somebody to disclose their disability, and having just an LLM rolled out company wide kind of removes that initial stage of requiring that disclosure and trust, because you're giving that tool to everybody anyway. So done well, I think anyway, AI could reduce emotional labor on disabled employees. It could reduce inconsistency across managers in terms of being given a reasonable adjustments often to the discretion of individual managers, and it also creates that process then becomes more dignified and faster, which then supports people in doing their work quicker and more effectively. There's huge potential.
Yeah, I had never thought about that opportunity for a tool like an LLM, which is being rolled out across a company, to have that that sort of democratizing, empowering effect for people with disabilities. But actually, the way you've explained it makes sense, that you know, people wouldn't want to have to expose themselves, but actually, if there's a tool there which they can use, which can help, then actually becomes really empowering. And I loved what you were saying about the sort of personalization, because a number of the conversations we're having now with companies working in the agentic space is around how agents can be even more powerful. One of the examples I often give is that, you know, a lot of companies will have dashboards, and they try and break down huge amounts of data into spreadsheets and dashboards that summarize that data into charts or diagrams or whatever it is, so you can measure targets and KPIs and that kind of stuff. And that's been sort of like, you know, something that lots of businesses have built in those dashboards. Actually, not everyone's able to process that information, and actually it's not a very human it's not a very natural process to read it like that. Actually, the ability of agents now is that the agents can well, one, gather all that information much more efficiently, but then they can bring it into a much more human digestible format that's personalized to you. So rather than having a dashboard, everyone has their own agent that can tell them the information they need. And not only can it tell you the information they need in the way that they're able to process, you can then talk back to it or communicate back to it, and it will then go and do the things that you want it to do. So it's basically like acting like a human, isn't it? That's a human interface.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether that is also people starting to think about the opportunities for how you could use agents to empower people with disabilities as well.
Yes. However, I think that for many people practically, or rather many organizations practically on the ground, that is the dream of being able to get there. But frankly, people just aren't using it in the workplace well enough. There is a massive training gap of you know, jumping from, you know, typing in your question into an LLM and getting a response back, to where we are now, kind of mainstream of, you know, building out prompts and knowing how to prompt correctly. The next jump of kind of training your own agent and all of the work that goes into that, you know, we can't expect the layperson to be able to kind of match the speed of this progress while also doing their job, and also you know, upskilling themselves on just digital skills in general. So there's definitely a responsibility of employers to have AI training, you know, as an integral part of learning and development anyway. But then I think there's also a responsibility of the developers to consider that human side of interacting with this technology. And actually, you know, as fun as it is to be able to kind of build your own agent and do that kind of side of that hyper personalization, like, I think there's a gap there. There's something that's missing of, you know, how do we bridge this technology so it's not just the tech minded people who are able to effectively use it and deploy it, and have a continuous, you know, training and know what to look for, and know what to do. You know, if we're talking about this being an effective tool for an organization, you know, there's an identified problem that I work at, reasonable adjustments. Who's the audience for that? Disabled people who need, even maybe don't class themselves as disabled, but recognize they could do with a bit of support in a specific area. And then actually what's their general skills level, and how do we either get them trained or get the technology to a point that it's understandable and it's, you know, simpler and easier and more intuitive to use. Because if we don't do that, what we're going to find is that skills gap is just going to keep on getting bigger and bigger, and we are going to leave people behind.
Interesting. And it's again, you're pointing out some really interesting dimensions to some of the challenges that we've seen, but maybe we haven't looked at the particular dimensions that you're sharing now. We often talk around inclusion, but actually, from looking at this from the dimension of disability, opens up some areas which maybe haven't had that light shone upon them. So training, I think, in particular, there's a lot of talk about training, right? So there's many training courses out there. I'd love to understand how you think training can best support raising awareness of disability and reasonable adjustments for disability. Is it that we need to train the leaders of the organizations, the managers in the organizations, or the everyday users? Those are the three levels that we typically look at when we're looking at skills. But is there one area that you think has more responsibility for understanding this, or does it need to be integrated into the entire company?
Gosh, I think there's even another dimension to that of training the developers on the impact of their technology, and the AI trained on existing data, we know it replicates existing bias, and that needs to be explicitly addressed at the design stage. If somebody with a disability is using a piece of technology, and as part of their want and the desire to hyper personalize it, are sharing about their disability, what we can't then have is that technology to then make assumptions based on data about the capabilities of that person, which there's a risk in that. We hold bias. It's a human thing to do, and we have to recognize that the AI that we're developing is going to hold that too, unless we are very aware of that and we have guardrails in place to identify that, and train the AI to either recognize that in themselves and learn from that, or potentially even be more inquisitive, and when somebody does raise that they have a disability, to ask more questions, to learn about their capabilities, not just make an assumption. I think there's also a really big risk at that management level of an organization. The training for them, I think, needs to mainly focus on that, as AI could potentially handle more of that admin side of inclusion, that employers feel like they've then ticked the box for being inclusive, without actually changing anything about the culture or understanding what that tool is doing, truly doing for inclusion, and why it matters, or where it's potentially failing, or where it could fail in the next certain amount of time, and what have they got in place to either flag that and stop it from happening, or reduce any harm that could come out of that. I think I call it a bit like it's a compliance theatre of, it's just the appearance of inclusion, not actually any substance to it. So for that management level, there needs to be training on what do we mean by reasonable adjustments? How can this be rolled out? How can you still support people, that this isn't just handing over the responsibility of support? It's a tool. It is nothing. It's nothing to replace anything. It's simply a tool to enable better support. And accessibility in AI isn't just about, screen readers or alt text being written, or, text being condensed. It's also about whether the system, so from design through to deployment, was built with disabled people's experiences in mind, rather than that retrofit of where we then panic because harm has come out of it that nobody expected, apart from disabled people who are there shouting about it already. And then there's that training level of the user, and actually do they feel empowered that when they log on in a morning to start work, that they know they have a tool right there that is ready to help them, and they know how to use it effectively. And I'd argue actually that for the majority that no, that isn't something that they feel empowered or equipped to use.
Yeah. Well, that's been really interesting there, and I think you're right. There's many different ways that we should look at what it means to be inclusive here in the training. So right from, you mentioned the foundational models and the data which they're trained on. So that's a slightly different use of training, but equally important. And all of the data that goes into that at the moment is quite, there's a number of biases, many different levels on that. I think we might not be able to get into it in this discussion, but we're looking at world models as well, which is the next generation of model which is being built. Now they have even different, even more complex analysis of the world, but maybe they're looking at that through a very biased lens of able-bodied people, and so there's a whole, like I say, in a whole other area we could look at there. But I think then we go on to, you know, looking within organizations at the skills that they need to have as managers. And whilst there are some tick boxes that you mentioned that people have to tick to show that they're being inclusive, it can't be a one and done thing. It has to be an ongoing process. It has to be the start of being open and being inquisitive and wanting to understand this rather than just that tick box exercise. We got on to talk about inclusion now. I wanted to understand from that, you know, what's your perspective of how we can change things? How can we make this more inclusive? Is it about getting the right people into the rooms, and sort of what have you seen that's maybe been positive in that area?
So disabled people being in the room when AI tools are designed, and by that I don't just mean, you know, it's a stereotype, but you know, the coder with autism, you know, that's not representative of disability. So, you know, looking around the room and thinking, you know, who's been involved in this process and is it representative? You know, co-design is something that, you know, is getting more popular, which is really encouraging to see. But you know, making sure that it's part of the project process just as a standard to have that level of input from the people who will ultimately be using this tool. And also I think something that would really help, and I think also empower employers themselves into making this part of their process, is any employer who's adopting a new AI tool as part of their procurement process to be asking, you know, what was your training data, who tested it, what failure models for users with disabilities were used, were they even used? You know, my research, both with my Churchill Fellowship and the white paper, showed that there is a massive gap in legislation, and developers and employers, I think, have a really big opportunity to really show what good looks like here. You know, policy is always going to fall behind and lag behind. The rate of technology is, you know, exponential in terms of, you know, policy. I don't think we'll ever be able to quite catch up with how it's being developed. And you know, there's a responsibility there of both for developers and for end users to use it responsibly, and defining what that means and coming together to talk about that, and to you know, build agreements for use so it is fair and it is equitable. I think that that would be my, you know, dream of being able to see something like that happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of so I was going to ask you actually, kind of, what's the one thing you'd like to see happen? But I think you've answered it there,
Yeah.
which is, people coming together. But it's also really, I think industry has a role here because we can hold the foundational models to account, because we are effectively their customers. So a lot of the companies who are building the apps or the platforms or the services, they're paying the money to those foundational models. And as you was outlining, we should be saying to them, we expect to know that the data that you're providing to us has been checked for biases, or has been checked for these other considerations, and that you have done it in a way which is going to benefit everyone. And that's, I think, something which we're going to see more of as the industry becomes more ethical. So I know you're kind of quite involved in helping with that as well. So just as we start to kind of wrap things up, then I wanted to understand how can we stay in touch with you, follow your work. What things have you got coming that you'd like us to know about?
I'm active on LinkedIn. Please do connect, follow on there. I post quite often, industry updates, news, thoughts, things that are going on. And that's probably the best place to find me. Otherwise, you can check out rachaelmole.com. That's my AI ethics home. Or there's Moleworks Solutions, which is my organization, my ops organization as well. Or you can get in contact with me directly at hello at moleworksolutions.com. And yeah, I'm always up to chat and to explore this topic, because I'm also very aware, like, I only represent one, but my lived experience, I only have the views of what I experience, and this is a continuous learning journey for myself and for all of us as well. So I'm always keen to connect with other, particularly like disabled people who are working in this space.
Great, thank you. And actually, just on that, I'm just curious, are there communities of people who are also coming together to kind of look at this within the AI space, how we can sort of raise awareness of disability and disability needs?
Yes, and I'd really recommend checking out Zero Project. They have an AI database of really good resources to use, and I'll send the link over to include with that as well. It's a fantastic resource, one that I use very often. And within that, there's their AI advisory board of kind of key people to be looking out for who are working in the AI and access space.
Amazing. Well, Rachel, thank you so much. I found it really interesting today. I've learned a lot, and I think you've helped me to fill in a lot of the blanks there. Some of the lack of information that I had, frankly, around what disability is, and the need to include that and have it more prominently within user design, specifically as the AI industry itself is developing. I think we all need to be aware of the impact which the technology can have. If we're not using it carefully, it's going to exclude people, but if we use it carefully, we can actually make sure we are including people, we are thinking about their needs, bringing them to that conversation. We've talked about the roles of employers. I think employers have a really important role to play here, and I know a lot of our members will be listening and taking on board what you're saying, and hopefully they've already got some programs in place. But then there's a broader industry. We really do need to be pushing for greater consideration of this from the foundational models which we all rely upon, and making sure that we have the right people in the room to help us understand this and to help to shape the future technology. So best of luck with everything you're working on, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Don't miss the next episode. Subscribe now. UKAI is the trade association for businesses across the UK. Tech and non-tech, large and small. AI is our business. Find out more at ukai.co.